Hello, everyone. Welcome to JavaScript Part 2 Advanced Functions, whereupon by the end of this lesson, I'm going to say you should be able to use first-class functions and then chains. I'm going to say that you should be able to use closures and maps. So we're going to explore a few different things that we can do with functions and what have you. And we're going to explore them through those two lenses. Let's dive in. All right, so first objective, use first class functions and then chains. Cool. Let's pull up a new JavaScript file. Let's say I'm doing a fetch. I'm getting something from the Pokemon API. Cool. So I get Pikachu, and then I parse that response. And then I take my parsed response and I do something with it. So this is the way that we probably taught you guys how to do this. And to this day, that's still generally how I write those things at first. One of the first things that I'll refactor this to is first class functions. So let's talk about what a first class function is. I want you to think to yourself for a second. Somebody asks you in a job interview, what's a first class function? What would you tell them? Think to yourself. Mr. Cho, do you have a guess for me? Unmute.
I would say a first class function is like the precedent function. So like it will always be like I don't know like the best word to use, but like it would always take precedent over all of the other, I guess.
It's a good guess. Way more complicated than it needs to be. I want to hear from someone else. Nate G, do you know what a first class function is? Unmute.
Still unmuted. Ugh, I honestly have no idea.
All right. So what an opportunity for some research. So I'm going to put 3 minutes on the clock. I would like everybody to look up what a first class function is, and then we're going to talk about it. 3 minutes on the clock. Go. Another minute. All right. I want to hear from someone. I want to hear from Blake Runyon. What is a first class function?
It's a function that can be treated as a variable.
Yeah. Function that can be treated as a variable. Cool. Nate G, anything to add to that?
You can pass them as arguments to other functions.
Yeah. And then Mr. Cho, anything to add?
You could store them in a variable.
Yep. Neat. Anything else y'all found about first class functions?
We can use double parentheses to invoke a function that's being closed over as a first class function.
Yep. Anything else we found?
It can be returned by another function.
Yeah. And these two in particular that's another concept that's all related to this. Think to yourself. I know some of you know what it is. Cool. Who can tell me what these two ideas together are called?
Closure.
Recursion?
Nope, not recursion, not closure.
Is that just functional programming?
It is a core part of functional programming. Has its own name though.
Higher order function?
Higher order function.
Oh shit.
A higher order function is something that can be passed as an argument to another function or returned by a function or both. Higher order function. But yeah, all of that is related to first class functions. So who cares? Why do we need a special name for this? What would it look like if we couldn't do this?
It'd be a lot more code.
Maybe. Have you guys ever had any experience with something that doesn't have first class functions?
Ruby.
Ruby. Ruby doesn't have first class functions. What does it have instead?
Helper methods?
Yeah, kind of.
Like objects.
We can have
and
helper
classes.
methods that are like functions also.
It has objects and classes.
Objects and classes. We have objects and classes in JavaScript.
Isn't like one of the primary ways that we use first order functions is as helper functions?
Can. But like in functional languages, like that's all you got. So it's your business logic, it's everything. So that's not necessarily a part of why this matters. We had helper methods all over Ruby. Ruby doesn't have first class functions.
Classes? I mean, because that's one thing that like we use in like an OOP language versus a functional language.
Yeah, we have classes in JavaScript though.
Yeah, that's true.
So in JavaScript, I can do something like const sum function equals function that does something, right? I can save that in a variable, and then I can pass some function around, pass it into another function. I can save it into another variable. I can make copies of it. I can invoke it. I can do all kinds of stuff. That's first class function. There's no equivalent idea in Ruby. Ruby doesn't have any methods that aren't part of classes. Even if you like, remember when we were doing basketball and we kept doing things like def calc points or whatever, some god awful acronym. Even that stuff, those weren't actually standalone functions.
Everything's a class.
Oop, everything is part of a
Oh,
class.
sorry. I said everything's a class. I didn't realize my mic was still on.
Yeah, everything's an object.
Object.
So when we were doing this kind of stuff in basketball, where's the class?
Main.
Main. So if you don't declare a class in Ruby, it's just implicitly in a class called main, but it's still a method of that main class. I can't save calc points into a variable. I can't pass it in as an argument to anything. Not how it works. Think about all the times, like, so if we had some other method in here. And it took yet another method as an argument. And I wanted to invoke that. Let's see, I'm going to make that. So if I was doing something like that, and I want to have some other method. So I'm calling that, and I'm going to pass in calc points to it. Can't do it. Even if I did make that a static method. Couldn't do it. Why? What is this doing?
I mean, isn't it? It's just calling a function inside of a function.
It's calling the function. It's not passing it a function definition. Remember how like we don't have to use the parentheses to invoke something in Ruby? There's no way to just get the definition of a function of a method in Ruby. If you dot whatever the method name is, it runs the method. That's it. End of the story. JavaScript, not so much. In JavaScript, we can totally save something in a variable. And then functions get treated like any other type. They're just like strings or objects or Booleans or whatever. One of the types of value you can have in JavaScript is a function. Not every language has that.
Is it fair to say that there's no equivalent to higher order functions in any pure OOP language?
You are correct. Now, Ruby sort of gets around that a little bit. I want everybody to think about this one. Don't yell it out. You think about what equivalent kind of idea exists in Ruby? It's not an OO idea, but it's how we sort of got around the fact that there aren't first-class functions in Ruby. Think to yourself. And I want to hear from Marnie. Marnie, what was a similar kind of idea we had in Ruby?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
No problem. So we don't have first-class functions in Ruby, but we still had something that was kind of like that. We use them with enumerables, with all kinds of different like looping constructs and stuff. We couldn't pass something a standalone function, but we could do something kind of similar. Do you remember what it was? Like if I was doing Marnie, do you remember the vocab word for what's happening in here?
Iterating?
Oh, close. What is this piece of it? The thing that starts with do and ends with end there.
I'm blanking. I'm sorry.
It's all good. Ben, can you help Marnie out?
Well, it's a function, isn't it?
It's not a function. It's kind of like a function.
Is it a method?
Almost. Each is the method. So this is the method here. This thing after it is getting passed into the method.
Argument?
Almost. We're going to keep struggling with it. We're going to get there.
Enumerable.
Nope, not quite.
Block.
Fong, what you
I
got?
think it's a block.
Block.
I asked Fong, but yes, it's a block. Similar kind of idea. We could also do those blocks with something like that. Instead of do and end, we could have had whatever if it was just kind of like a one-line thing. That was Ruby's equivalent to this idea. Some standalone piece of behavior.
So if what's happening whenever we create like strong params in a controller, and then we pass the parameters method in as an argument, if that's not operating as a first class function?
Sure. So the strong, so let's take a look at like what this might be. So I have some controller in Ruby, and then maybe I have a index method, and then I want to, let's see, now it'd be like a create method, and then I'm going to make a dog.create, and this would be like dog params, and then we would have our the strong params in here. So it'd be like params dot require whatever, but whatever the strong params thing is. So what's happening here? It's not passing in the definition of this method. It's actually invoking it. And so whatever the resulting thing of this, which is Rails magic, don't try to like think about how it works too much, but it's still going to be the result of calling that method, not the actual definition of it itself.
Is this like, it's not referential integrity, because that's what databasing, this is
Referential transparency.
Yeah.
Similar kind of idea. Not exactly that, but close enough.
Okay, so what's actually happening here is like we're just doing the method. It's not that it's passing it. Oh,
Correct.
oh, so like in JavaScript, you can pass it without invoking it. And that's whenever
Right.
it's being used as a first class function. So when you're invoking it as an argument, that's not a first class function. That's just,
Correct.
got it. Got it.
You
Okay.
found the beat. So the result of calling all of this is a hash, or it throws an error if it doesn't match up with something. So that's how it does that. Cool. So we were talking about blocks. So languages that don't have first-class functions, they have things like blocks instead. That was the thing that got added to Ruby because, believe it or not, first-class functions fucking rule. And so since they don't really exist in OOP languages, that's a way to kind of hack around that. There's a similar kind of thing in Java called lambdas that accomplish the same kind of thing. This is such a useful idea. Being able to define a little piece of behavior and then have it completely standalone. So let's see. I want to check for understanding on that just a little bit. Marnie, back over to you. The thing we were just talking about, tell me about what Ruby has instead of first-class functions.
So Ruby, when you put a function as an argument, it calls that function.
Yep. And then when we're doing like the enumerables and stuff, what do we pass in instead of like method definitions or something like that? Starts with the B?
Block.
Block. Very nice. Ben, what do we pass into an enumerable instead of like being able to pass in a function?
Method.
Oop, almost. Same question as Marnie's. We're not passing in.
Object.
Oop, we're passing in, starts with the B.
Sure.
Starts with the B. Marnie just said it.
Block. The
Block.
same thing.
There we go. Same thing. So we don't have first-class functions in Ruby. We have blocks. So JavaScript, though, we got first-class functions. We can just keep these function definitions hanging around. So now let's talk about how we can use those. So go back up to this fetch. It's the way that we teach this pattern. It's really easy to just kind of pattern match it. I don't think there's any problem with that. That's exactly where you should start with this. But let's think about what's actually happening, like JavaScript syntax-wise, on these lines. So on line 2, we are calling .then. We're invoking it. It's a method. And the method takes one argument. The argument that the .then method takes is a function. It's a function definition. So if I wrote another function definition, let's say it was something like parse response. Take a look at what's happening on that line. We use that cool fat arrow syntax. We could also use that here. Let's say parse response is response fat arrow. We could do that. We could also do that as like that, like that. All three of these are the exact same thing. No difference between them.
Is there a best practice on what's easiest to read?
Sure, that's a great question. This is one of those questions where like, if you ask 3 people, you're gonna get 6 answers. I'll give you my take on it. I really like declared functions. And one of the reasons I like them is that they hoist. Hoisting is when, if I put this function definition at the bottom of the file, I can still use it up here. Doesn't matter where your function definitions are. JavaScript, the JavaScript engine just figures out, cool, I got that, that function available later. I'll figure it out. versus these other two, they don't hoist. So if I didn't have this one in here and I tried using parse response, that's going to break. It'll go, I don't know what that means.
Is it fair to say that the input of a promise is a function definition?
Yes, not quite. That's
Okay,
more complicated. Hold on, let me stick with this for just a sec.
Sure, for sure. Sorry. I've had that question on a sticky note for a while.
Okay, I promise I'll answer it. So these things don't hoist. I think that is really convenient. I think this less so. You should also know that hoisting doesn't exist in a lot of languages. So people who came from other languages think that this is really fucking confusing. And this is a lot more straightforward. They don't want something that hoists. And I'll also say those people are winning right now. So if you were to try to get like a consensus best practice for like how you should be writing functions in JavaScript in 2021, I'm going to call this one the unfortunate winner. No function keyword like this. No declared function like this. Most people write their stuff like this. And in mod 4, you almost have to write your functions like this.
So if you did it that way, you'd have to put it above the dot
Correct.
then.
Exactly. If I wanted to use that on line 2, then it has to go here. Good insight. And some of this is historical. This is original. This was New Coke. And this was Kids These Days. So this one goes back to 1995. This one is probably, say we got function expressions, maybe 2005 or so. We got this like not that long ago, 2014 probably. You'll still see all three of them every now and then, but this one's probably the most popular.
Hey, Kyle.
Yep.
Voicing is like something that I really have a hard time getting in my head. Can you just
Yeah.
give like a really like simple, general, like easy to know, like remember definition of hoisting?
Sure.
How it works?
When you declare a function, which means the function keyword comes first, it doesn't matter where you put the function in the file. You can use that function anywhere. That's your simple, easy to understand one. The slightly more technical answer is that in JavaScript, the names of things, the names of declared functions and their implementations are treated separately. And so as like the JavaScript engine is looking through this file, it does a quick pass before it processes anything. And in that quick pass, it goes, cool, there's a function called parse response. I'm going to hoist that like I'm running it up a flagpole. I'm going to hoist that up to the very top of the file so I can use it first. But your simple definition is function declarations, which means it starts with the function keyword. That gets hoisted, which means you can use it anywhere.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Please.
So on line 10,
Yep.
With that formatting, from what I understand, you're only supposed to write one-liners that way. Is
You
that correct?
like, it's, no, you don't have to. So here's some other ways we could write this same thing. We could put parentheses around the argument. We could put braces around that, like that. You could do it and leave these off. All of these are the same thing too. So if you do it in one line, you don't have to use the return keyword, which is kind of nice. You get implicit returns like you do in Ruby. But it's helpful for you to know that all of these are just different syntaxes for the exact same thing. They're not magic. And really, they're the same thing as these things also. The same way you can have the Arabic numeral one or the Roman numeral one, and they're all talking about one. Same kind of thing. Different representations.
Sorry, this may be like kind of a stupid question, but like when you set const parse response, like on line 10, when you call it the exact same syntax as you would your 24 function, correct?
Correct. Because they're the same thing. Every single one of those would be invoked like that.
Even if you pass it in as an argument.
Even if you pass it in as an argument. That's not a thing we could do in Ruby.
If you would call 10, does it just already like implicitly know that something's going to be passed to it since you have it like set equal to the argument that is there? You don't have to like call it and then in your parentheses actually pass in something.
Oh, I would. So if I do this, I want you to think about what error I'm going to get. I'm going to get an error.
Yeah, it's gonna
think of yourself. I'm gonna call on somebody. What error will I get? Chris Fallon.
Dude, I knew you were gonna pick me. What error will you get if what?
If I invoke this like this without passing anything in. And it doesn't matter which implementation, all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these will break for the exact same reason.
Like the wrong number of arguments given?
So we would get that in Ruby because Ruby enforces the arguments matchup. JavaScript doesn't. JavaScript doesn't care whether or not you actually give it the argument. It's saying if you do, it's going to be saved as this variable. You're kind of on the right track though. Keep going. Think through the implementation, any one of these. So this is, what's the value of this, Chris? Based on how I called it on line 28.
It's nothing.
It's nothing. But like nothing is what we would say in just like regular English language.
It's undefined.
Undefined. Okay, so it's undefined. So what's the problem with this line?
It's gonna, I guess maybe it just returns you undefined because it doesn't know what to do with that.
Ooh, good guess. Not quite. Phil
It returns
H.
you nil or null.
Almost. Phil H, what happens here? What's the error?
I think you're going to get uninitialized.
Maybe. So let's try swapping this out. If response is undefined, that means that like these are the same thing. So what's the problem with that?
Can I make another guess, Kyle?
Please do.
Is it like just like a type error?
It is a type
Like
error.
it doesn't know how to run it on that thing. Like it can't invoke JSON on that.
Bingo. Because undefined doesn't have methods. It's a type error. So if I try to call the JSON method of undefined, it's going to go, dog, I don't have methods. I'm undefined. So yeah, I'd need to pass something that has a JSON method. So that could be that works. More questions about any of this so far?
I have a question, Kyle.
Yeah.
The 3 different types of function definitions you have, like
Yeah.
if you were to console.log
Mhm.
parse response without invoking the function, just the words parse response, without the parentheses, would you get the same thing for each of the 3 definitions?
Yeah, I'll bet so. Let's check. So if I take, see, I'll do this one first. Okay, so this is fat arrow function expression. Just gives me back the function. Cool. So that was fat arrow function expression. Now let's try regular function expression. Regular old function. It's got like a little bit more juice on it because like I'm lying a little bit. They're not identical, but they may as well be. They're not different in any important way. All right, and then function declaration, last one. Come on. Oh, come on, stop. There we go. What do you know? Function definition. Same thing.
Cool. Okay. Thanks.
Other questions?
So why do we care? What can we actually do with this? Like what changes in our fetch response pattern?
You're beautiful. That's exactly where we're going. So if I have this awesome parse response, let's say I'm just going to keep this one. So if I have this cool parse response, and that's a function definition, and .then is something that takes a function definition, well, geez, can I just swap that out? And you're goddamn right I can.
And
Hey now, what?
sorry, just so I understand you here, because that's a one-line function up top, it's just going to automatically return you that response.json, right?
Remember, this is the definition. So this fat arrow function that we had before, that's not a function invocation. That's just a definition of a function. Parse response is the definition of a function. So this and this are the exact same thing.
So why don't we have to pass an argument into parse response?
Aha. So we didn't pass an argument in here. We said when this function gets invoked, it is expecting a parameter called response when it does get invoked. But we didn't actually pass anything in there either. This promise chain has some magic that will invoke that function and pass something into it. But
So
think about what's actually, actually, here's another way we could have written that exact same thing. And this is actually how people wrote this for a long time. Exact same thing. This, identical.
So if you were to explain line 1 in English, would like
Yep.
a correct sentence be when parse response is invoked, response will be passed in as the argument for response.json, like that function.
Almost. You're really close. Let's and this is a thing that like you'll hear people use interchangeably a lot, but they're not the same thing. An argument is when it's invoked. A parameter is when it's defined. So response is a parameter, whereas if I actually invoked it, I'm passing in that argument.
So whenever we use a parameter in a function definition, is that a reference? So like, let's say we have we use like some parameter called foo, right? And then in the function itself, we're referencing foo as the argument to be called later on.
Yes.
With in the function block, right?
Yes.
Would that be just a parameter reference then?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Parse response is a function definition. Remember, I console logged it. If I console logged that, it looks just like if I declared it with the function keyword. .then is expecting a function definition. If I do this, what comes out of that?
Do we get that same type error?
Potentially. It really depends on, well, yeah, I guess we would because we're not passing anything in. Even if we passed in like a JSON method and whatever else. Let's say we did something like that. So it doesn't throw the type error anymore. Still, what do we get back? What actually got passed into to .then?
Nothing?
Nothing. Well, the undefined that came back from this function. If I made it 2 or whatever, then I passed in 2 to .then. But .then was looking for a function definition, not a number. That's why we're not invoking it. It's not looking for the result of parse response. It's looking for the definition of parse response. The fetch magic is going to end up calling parse response, not us. That's why we don't have to give it a response.
So Kyle, is it basically saying we're making a fetch to an API or a library with data, right? Then we're calling the parse response the function definition of it. So basically when we do get that promise back, that promise is going to go into the parse
Yes.
response. So that's why we're not actually invoking it. It's because
Correct.
that fetch promise, it's going to actually pass it down.
Yes.
Okay.
The promise is calling the function. And like, we don't need to worry about why and how and whatever it gets that done. We're just giving it a set of instructions to call whenever it does.
So what do you call the input of a promise then? Like, let's say we chained out a couple .thens here, right? Like response on lines. Okay, so just what you have, but like response on line 7.
Yep.
What is that?
Great question. And I kind of want to know if any of you can answer it. So I want you to think about that for a sec, because I doubt that many of you like know this and are confident in the answer, but I want to see where your thought process is at. So think to yourself for a second, what is that? What does that come from? Think to yourself. Nick Gray, what do you think where do you think response comes from?
It comes from the API.
Ooh, like ultimately all of this kind of does, but this value in particular
Is it the JSON value from the API of Pikachu?
So yeah, if we're working with this exact example, so Pikachu comes back, we're giving it this parse response. This response parameter right here is going to end up being like the HTTP response. We just want to take the JSON that's in that response and get the object out of it. So then what does this end up being?
The params?
Almost.
It would be the Pikachu object then?
Pikachu object. So that's what that is. Let's like get one level more abstract now. So if what happened was let me take the first class function out for a sec. So if I do response.json like this, I could call this raw response. Might be a little confusing to use. Same word. So this is what's happening. We get the raw HTTP response. We take the JSON in there and get the Pikachu object out. That's the parsed response. So now, Nick, going one level more abstract, how are these promises actually working? Where did parsed response come from?
Parsed response came from the object passed into JSON, basically.
Like you're right there. It's the result of this. It's the return value of that function. That's what parsed response is. Let's look at this another way. If I just start a promise chain, random ass promise chain. It's whatever the return value of the previous function definition ends up being. So we gave it this function definition. When we got an actual Pikachu HTTP response object, we took that and ripped out, and this function took that response and returned back the object inside of it. That becomes the thing that gets passed into as an argument, this function definition. That's the pattern.
So I guess like maybe going one step even further.
Mm-hmm.
Why have a second dot then? Why not save your parse response into a variable that you could then just call like smaller functions throughout your entire JavaScript as opposed to packing everything into that second then?
Sure. So what Phil's asking is, what if I did something like this instead? What if I do dot then, and then in my do all the things function, it takes in a response, and then I do something like parse response, and I pass in the response, and like, but already we start running into the issue. This is asynchronous. So now, like, I need some way to handle that. Well, how do you handle asynchronous code? With dot thens. So now I need to like dot then off of that. But even still, it's a lot handier to be able to break this problem up into small pieces, because now they're independently testable, a lot easier to read. And check this shit out. If I do something like parse response here, and then I had maybe so I take that Pikachu object that I get, and I maybe have a function called like get name that takes a Pokemon object. We just say Pokemon here, buddy. And it returns Pokemon.name. And then I have something like display string. It takes in a string. And maybe it's something like document.query selector. Okay, so I have these like tiny ass functions. I can make these all arrows also. Exact same thing. Cool. So I got these three functions here. Check out how beautiful this promise chain looks now. So I parse the response, I get the name, I display the string. If I extract out this URL, look at that. It reads like a fucking story. That's easy to read. And that's where we want to end up with these promise chains. That is a thing of beauty. The inline Lambda functions, like I said, I still write them that way myself when I'm writing the code. When I refactor the code, I try to make it look like this. Because in 3 months, when I'm looking at this code again, that's what I want to see, not all the inline stuff.
So is there no like formal term for it for like the input of a promise chain other than the output of the previous promise?
Yep.
Okay. And I guess the bet like the best way that I can think about that is the fact that like all those .vens are technically part of the same, like it could be one line. We're just cleaning it up by doing multi-line, right?
Correct. Now,
So
like there's a gotcha in here though. Parse response is asynchronous. These two aren't. And so part of the cool thing about having those then chains is that with code, so much of the time, you're bouncing back and forth between stuff that's synchronous and stuff that's asynchronous. And so you spend some time in synchronous land. Oh no, and then I got to deal with async land for a little bit. And then whenever that's done, it comes back to sync land. And then, oh, go back to async land. And so you go back and forth on all of these things. Part of the beauty of having these promise chains is that the thens don't give a shit whether the thing inside of them are synchronous or asynchronous. It works exactly the same with either one. So then, instead of managing the back and forth on those, we spend all of our time in async land. A lot easier to wrap your head around eventually.
Can you explain it like I'm 5, asynchronous and synchronous as far as programming goes?
Absolutely. So, see, the explain it like I'm 5 would be, imagine me, Lou Loeffler, and Nick Gray all have to write something on a whiteboard. So if we're doing it synchronously, that means that I write something on the board, and then I hand the marker over to Nick. And then Nick writes something on the board and he hands it over to Lou. This, then this, then this. In asynchronous programming, you can think of it more like all of us are kind of writing on the whiteboard at the same time. Each of us has a marker, but we have specific places on the whiteboard for each of us to write our stuff so that it ends up being in the correct order. But all three of us get to write at the same time. That's asynchronous programming.
So what you're saying is like chaining those dot thens.
Yes.
Since it's asynchronous, all of that will essentially be running at the same time. So it doesn't matter how many dot thens you chain onto a fetch response?
Not quite. Like the metaphor breaks down a little bit with that. What it's more like is if I have all of these things and then I have other behavior, yet another behavior. So if this is my code, what's going to happen is it's going to fire off that fetch request and then just keep going. It's going to go immediately to other behavior and yet another behavior. And then whenever this asynchronous thing actually finishes, then it's going to do this. And then while it's working on that, it's going to keep on going. And then whenever this thing finishes up, then it's going to go to there. So it's going to enforce an order, but it's not going to hold the rest of the program hostage. If this was all synchronous, like the way that it is in Ruby, then while we're waiting for this fetch request to come back, nothing else can run. That's like inefficient in the best of circumstances. In a web browser, that means your browser locks. There's no multitasking with a processor. The processor, it's a rock that we tricked into thinking. So like it doesn't do more than one thing at once. It lives in a very temporal, synchronous kind of world. So the way that we can trick it into doing more than one thing at once is say, hey, this parse response thing, it can't happen until this is done. But this stuff doesn't depend on it. So you can get that done at your leisure. And every time you finish one of these, why don't you check back in and see if this is done yet?
So in the real world, you could be fetching your data and those other two functions might be a loading screen and animation or something?
Totally. Or it's something that just doesn't depend on that fetch finishing, including another fetch. So if I have this Pokemon thing, and I also am looking up a user and their account, cool. It can trigger like both of those things and they can both be cranking. And I've declared that like these things really can't happen until this is done. And they need to happen in this order, but I don't care that these things might happen at a different time than them. That's async.
Would you, okay, so I got two questions. The first one is something like, I can't remember what the Pokemon API does it specifically, but basically if you fetch on a, let's say like a type, right? It'll return a list of Pokemon, but then you can get their own URLs out.
Yep.
Would you, so first question is nested fetch or return value with additional fetch?
Cool. So they'll both work. But part of the point of the design of thens is that you don't have to nest them.
Got it.
So like, if you can flatten it out, that helps a lot. Now, here's the gotcha on this. And this is where the thing that we're not going to get to, which is using the closures and shit.
I just asked for that in order to give you something to work with.
It's all good.
You were like, I don't know what I'm doing.
this is where that would come in handy. So yeah, if I leave off the specific Pokemon, it doesn't really give me that much detail on these things. It just gives me the URLs that you can get the things at or whatever. So awesome. I parse the response and then I might take my Pokemon list that I get out of that. And so now I need to take that list of Pokemon and turn that into a list of URLs. So maybe I do something like, let's see, how do I take an array of objects and turn it into an array of URL strings?
Map it out.
Hey, map it out, Chris. I'm about to map it out, Chris. I'm about to. Yeah, we can just pull out like whatever that URL is. Now we have an array of these URLs. So this is like promises 103 or so, but there's a thing called promise.all that lets us do multiple promises at the same time and then wait until every single one of them is done before you move on. So it takes an array of promises. All right. Well, I could take my array of URLs and turn those into an array of fetches also. So I could say something like fetch URL. Okay. So now this is an array of fetches. And now I can wait for all of them to finish. And then have like the results of all those Pokemon. Pretty fucking cool, right?
And so because of that, you can do like multiple calls, multiple fetches, multiple endpoints, and have all the kind of things.
Yeah, if there's 1,000 Pokemon on this list, this promise.all is going to wait until all 1,000 of those HTTP requests are done, and then give you all of those in an array right here.
Won't it do that anyway? Because it's because of just of the way that the promise works. Like if you're doing a map.
Because this doesn't actually.
Oh, I didn't see the nest. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't actually start the fetch.
So would it be a good lesson to ask for? So my second question was going to be, how creative can we get inside of a promise? Because like, for instance, I found out the very hard way that you can't return anything out of a fetch call, even if it's a function. But I've kind of discovered that you can assign values, or you can kind of like perform actions, like printing something to the screen.
So hold on, pause. You can return things out of these. They just need to be in this then chain. If you return something out of them, it becomes available in that next then block. That's the trick.
Well, but I'm saying like if I'm trying to pull something out, would I guess maybe set, so like, okay, so the Pokemon that we have right now, right, in our final dot then is going to be an array of Pokemon, right?
Yep.
Now, how would I just take that out of there other than
you don't. Like that's the thing, is that since there's nothing you can do, if you have something that requires having all those Pokemon, it requires that all of these things happen first. You want it in the then chain.
Got it. But would that be a good lesson to ask for as far as like what all we can do inside of a promise chain, like how flexible we can get with it?
Maybe, but like keep in mind they're just functions. So if like this is a show all Pokemon function that we end up calling with that takes in a list of Pokemon, this doesn't look like it's in that list at all, and shows all the Pokemon. We've declared the behavior totally separately, and now we can use that first class function to say that should occur after all of these things have occurred. And it'll get called with like your list of Pokemon.
Got it.
That's how you get a value out.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. Perfect.
And that's another reason that we don't want to just jam all the behavior into one function. And then if I'm finishing you guys know how much I hate these inlines. The whole point of this is I want to be able to make this read a little bit better. I could make this a function called like get all Pokemon. And it takes in a Pokemon list and then does all of these things. And now this is get all Pokemon. Ta-da, done. And it's beautiful. A lot easier to debug that. Easier to debug that than even like that was. Cool. Hopefully that's helpful to you guys. Any last questions? All right, cool. Have a good day.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks,
You're
Kyle.